So we're going to be going over optimizing Windows for gaming, specifically going in and showing you game settings. I'll be using Elden Ring as an example today, but just know every game I'll walk through settings that you should be changing inside your game, but also inside your Windows instance, as I use Windows primarily for gaming, and I optimize the heck out of it because out of the box, there's so many little gotchas that's going to cause stuttering. It's going to cause just it's going to make your life a living hell when it comes to gaming. So let's fix all that. First up, let's work on the system itself, Windows itself. Let's get that in line. The first thing I do, obviously, I've made my debloat utility. I highly recommend using that for many of these tweaks. So what you do is just copy this, launch into PowerShell with admin or Windows Terminal. From Windows Terminal, you'll just enter that line in and hit enter, and it'll launch this utility. Everything's open source here. It's on GitHub if you want to check it out. Really, this just installs programs automatically for you. Just click the program and it installs it, like Discord and other things that many gamers use. System tweaks, there's a lot of options, but really there's only a few I'm going to show you today. I always recommend essential tweaks and then just performance visual FX right here. This will take away some of the dragging around. You'll see how it's just kind of a frame. So you don't get nearly the appearance. So if appearance is your thing, just switch back with appearance FX. Past that, we need to control power settings. Now, a lot of Windows 11 and even Windows 10 now relies on game mode, and game mode is hit and miss. I know AMD problems. AMD cards have a lot of problems with it. NVIDIA cards sometimes get a performance boost, but let's take that variation out and just control power ourselves. I like to use the old power panel from Windows 7 and use ultimate performance. This makes sure my system doesn't throttle. Now, if you're on a laptop, please note it will use more power, so you may not want to utilize this section of it. But if you come into here, just click old power control, hit ultimate performance or high performance, one of the two, it doesn't matter, and it will use more energy, but it will not throttle your PC, so you're not going to see any stuttering or it dropping down because it decided to throttle your CPU. If you don't see anything and it's just balanced here, I did make a restore power options, and this just goes through and adds all those power options into our old Windows 7 power panel. So you can see actually I duplicated quite a bit of it right there. But ultimate performance, high performance, choose one of those. I'll probably have to flush that out. But moving on past that, Windows updates is the next thing. You don't want Windows updates in the background causing problems. On this, I always recommend just clicking security updates only. This delays all feature updates, but it does give you security updates, so you stay getting those security updates you need, but not the ones that might add a feature or break your system and cause you to reboot mid-game. It also sets the active time to be, I think, from 7 a.m. all the way to like 3 a.m. or something like that. So it's a very good time to where it's not going to just reboot your system while you're playing a game or some other shenanigans like that. So now we've done pretty much everything in the toolbox here. I'm going to close out of it. There's some other optimizations I would recommend doing in here. First one would be indexing of your drive. One thing I would highly caution you to do, if you have a secondary drive where I put my games like me, I would go ahead and uncheck allow files and contents to be indexed and hit apply, and then it'll take probably a good 30 minutes if you have a lot of files. I only have 400 gigs here, so this would probably only take 10-15 minutes to jam through. But basically what it does is it unindexes all those. So while you're playing your game, Windows Indexer, the search, isn't spooling through all your files, searching and indexing them. So when you type in search and you go Elden Ring, it's not going to sit there and go through all your files. It's just going to say, is the Elden Ring app there or not? And that's about all it's going to do. You can also do it on the C drive as well. Just know this will basically turn off search. I don't like Windows search at all. I think it's I know it causes a lot of performance issues and can also cause stuttering. So I like to just disable both those there, and you can even go take this a step further and disable the Windows Search Update service. However, just unindexing all the files in C and D or your hard disks will be sufficient, as that is where most of the performance loss comes from. But if you have like Outlook or other things, it can degrade your performance if you use those types of apps using Windows Indexer. And let's get into the actual game performance modifications and things I see everyone do. And honestly, a lot of YouTubers make massive mistakes when saying, hey, you need to do it this way or that way. One thing I would recommend is MSI Afterburner. Now, typically this is known as like a overclock utility. However, I don't want you overclocking your system. I don't recommend it because many people just step into this and like, well, I'm just going to increase the power to my graphics card. This can cause life to come off that graphics card. It's not going to last as long. My Vega 64 here is 5 years old, I think. About 4 or 5 years old. Whenever it came out is when I got it, and I'm still using it. So this is not a high-end system by any means, but it's not a low-end system either. And if I was overclocking the system with just regular fans, not custom cooling or a custom loop or something like that, well, I'm going to be degreasing the life of this. And I really discourage people from overclocking unless you really know what you're doing and you're using like a custom loop or a custom water cooling setup. Closed loops and stuff you buy in the store don't count. Yes, you can overclock a little bit if you really know what you're doing, but many times I see people go too far. They cause artifacting and take off the life of the system. With that said, this utility is fantastic for many other reasons that I'm about to touch, and it's going to help us fine-tune our game. So download and install it. Under the option where it says the Rivia statistics, you want to go ahead and enable that as well. That is, you'll see the little plane here, but this little blue one, Rivia statistics tuner, is also something that should be installed with Afterburner. We're going to launch into Afterburner. You might look a little differently. Just look for the cog. I put this under a Windows 11 theme, as this is Windows 11. And there's really only a couple things we need to do here. First, start with Windows, start minimized, and then come to OSD, set the hotkey so you can turn this on and off. I put mine Control-Shift-Alt-S. You choose whatever suits your needs. Just don't make it too simple because it might be a hotkey you use elsewhere. So I like to make it a little bit complex. For monitoring, I like to just monitor GPU temperatures, memory usage, and really you don't even need to do that. I just kind of like seeing what my temps are at. I'd say you want to keep everything under about 80 Celsius, but it just depends on your setup again. Towards the bottom here is really the big thing you need to have. The rest of that is just kind of fluff. Don't put a whole bunch of CPU powers. It's cringe every time I see a YouTuber put like 16 CPUs and like that doesn't tell you jack. There's nothing you're reading into that other than just putting a bunch of garbage up on your screen. So just put frame rate, that's your FPS, and frame time, but make sure you put OSD text graph. Those are the two biggest things. I like to see the min and average, but you don't need to. So with that set up, we have our OSD, our frame rate. Now we can see the effect because every game's going to be a little bit different. And you need to know if the stuff you're doing improves your performance or doesn't improve your performance. So let's go ahead and launch into game. And we're just going to launch into Elden Ring here. And this is an EAC title, which we will be touching on, anti-cheat and performance effects. The actual system I'm running on is an AMD 5600X with a Vega 64. So not a great system, but not a bad system either. All right. Elden Ring's where we're going to start, but you can use any game for this. Cyberpunk was another good one. I had to kind of tweak a lot. First thing most people do is come into their video options in their game of choice, set up their screen mode. You're probably going to want to do full screen. It's going to give you a little bit more FPS. I like borderless because I am often switching back and forth. So that's one thing I would say from just get-go. One second, I'm going to take down the music just a hair. Then the next thing is quality settings. Typically people come in here, set it to high. They don't really change too much in here, and then they just kind of jump into game. This being basically a mid-tier system, we probably will be getting around 30 FPS, I think, at stock settings. But let's see what we get. The things to watch is the FPS up here, and also looking at those frame times. If you see a bunch of jagged lines on those frame times, you're definitely running into problems. Frame times look really good. I'm just kind of spinning around just to see if we get any stuttering. So a lot of this is caused by system stuff when you have frame time issues. But we're seeing a pretty solid frame time. That's good. The FPS is still a little bit low. A lot of people could play at 30 FPS. I would not recommend it. So we're going to probably change a few settings. So we're average frame times probably around the mid 30s, I would say. Let's go ahead. And also when you're doing this, do it in a spot with like a lot of lighting and a lot of stuff going on. So this is a perfect spot because you get a little bit of the highs and lows when it comes to lighting, and you have a lot of objects and wind. So you're going to get the most FPS. If you're like in a room somewhere staring at a wall, it's not exactly the best example of FPS. You got like a flame, but you can even go like that. You can see how the FPS adjusts depending on what's on your screen. So really important to notice that. All right, so let's fix the FPS. What are the first settings I look at in a game? If we come into System and I come over to here, just come into Advanced Settings. First thing I usually do, especially in this game, depth of field really doesn't do much. And motion blur is another option that has a performance impact and actually is kind of a crappy option in my opinion. So just taking these two things off, you can see our FPS has already jumped over 40. So the next big option that you'll see in games that make a big difference is if we come over to here and we come into advanced option. It's called SSAO. A lot of this other stuff, a lot of people put too much stock in, and usually they don't really cause too much performance hits. Lighting and shadows, typically you start seeing a massive visual difference when you start messing with these settings. So I like to kind of leave these on a high because I like my game to look good. And ambient occlusion, though, I think we can take off and probably get another couple FPS. Let's see what this does. We'll get out, and looks like we got another 2 FPS there. And you can see it really didn't affect the look of the game very much. Still looks very, very pretty. The other thing I've done here is I'm using a shader, and I can actually turn that on and off by doing this. You can see the reshade. Reshade will actually cause some performance issues, but I like using reshade because I'm able to get a lot more visually stunning photos with a very little performance increase. So this is it off, and then if we look here and turn it on, this is it on. So off, it's a little more washed out. It's a little more vibrant with it on, but you see I sacrifice a little bit of FPS by doing that. So I'm going to leave it off for now because we're still not to that 60 FPS number. Now, a lot of other people would start going in and just dialing back those settings. Don't do this because this is pretty, honestly, so pretty I'd almost play right at it because, well, it's very close to 60 FPS. But let's say you absolutely had to have 60 FPS. The next thing I would do is reduce this from 1440 to 1080p. Resolution makes a big difference. And if you're on a really low-end system, let's say you got a old card in there because you can't get a new card, reduce this to 720. You'd be shocked at how good a 720 picture looks with good textures, good shadows, good lighting. Again, the resolution isn't everything. Everyone's always obsessed about 4K or 10K, and I've seen people run like 4K, but it runs at 30 FPS, and they're like, ugh, that's awful. Or they dial back the feature settings of shadows and lighting to get 4K from like a 1440p or even a 1080p, and that 1080p is going to look light years better than that 4K. So really important. So changing it to 1080p, it looks like we got a solid 60 FPS now. So let's go ahead and try and fight something. Let's see if we see anything happen to our frame times. Right now it's pegged at 60, which tells me we've done a really good job with the optimization here. So we'll do a couple fights. If you do play this game, don't open this chest. It's a trap. So we'll actually get teleported out here. This actually traps you in like a high level zone, so we're actually going to a higher end portion of the game now. All right, so here's our trap dungeon. Let's see how this looks. Looks pretty good. And now we need to talk about FPS. So now we've capped our FPS at 60. Do we need to go above FPS 60 or not? That is the question. Some people are obsessed with getting as much FPS as possible, and I just want to tell you, that is actually not a good course of action, because if you have an old monitor and it's only 60 hertz, well, you're not going to see a noticeable difference in 60 FPS or 120 or 300. It just makes no difference because the refresh rate of that monitor can only render basically 60 FPS. So you're not going to do anything. So the first thing I would do is come into your display settings. Let's look at the advanced portion of it. What can your display do? Mine can do 165 hertz at 1440p. So I could actually increase this a little bit. Let's say I did want to be capped at 60 FPS. Now, how Elden Ring works is the game itself is hard coded for 60 FPS. And one thing I would do, let's say that's about where you want to be, come into your Rivia statistics server from MSI Afterburner, add the executable for that system, and then cap it at 60 FPS. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and wipe out that cap, and we're just going to put it at 0. And then I'm also going to download a utility. On GitHub, there's also an open source utility, FPS Unlocker. There's a bunch of them on the market, but this is one of the only open source ones I've seen. And I'm just going to download this guy right here and launch it from my downloads. So let's launch this, run it, and this is a little FPS unlocker. Yeah, there's a couple cheats there. Let's not use those though. And we could actually lock the frame rate at 144 so we can get above that 60 FPS. And also it has something cool here where we can start the game without EAC or anti-cheat. Now, if you do this, you can't use the online option because anti-cheat's pretty much required for multiplayer for a lot of games. So if you do bypass anti-cheat, or let's say this tool doesn't exist for your game, what you can do a lot of times is just copy the executable. And let's say I wanted to bypass this all the time, but I didn't want to launch this utility. I'd come into my Steam library and come into Elden Ring game, and the game that is doing, it's launching this start protected game.exe, and what I can do is just do 2, then come into Elden Ring here, and I'm just going to copy that, come back over here, paste it, and then I'm just going to rename this Start Protected Game. Now, this executable, if it's a different game, you're going to want it to be that launcher, whatever that is. So let's paste that in here, and you can see like that. Now, I could launch right here, launch into here. It's going to launch an Elden Ring without using EAC, without any third-party tool. Now, personally, I don't really like that way. I like using this little tool because it does FPS unlocking as well, and it also gives ultra-wide support. And this way, we can do the frame rate lock as well. So if we look, we've got our MSI Afterburner and everything going. We'll start this now without a EAC if you did want to do it. I want to show both methods of removing anti-cheat for offline play because I think the multiplayer in Elden Ring is particularly bad. All right, now we're in the game. Let's see what we get for FPS. I've noticed that my FPS actually has dropped where it was at a solid 60. Let's see, did I have reshade open? So let's turn reshade off, and we can see we're getting above, still not great on FPS, mid 60s, but you can definitely see we're getting above that 60 cap now. We'll come down in here. You can see our FPS getting up to almost 100 now. And if I was running this not in mirrored mode, so I can capture it for y'all, this would look a lot different. But now you can see on the load screen we're capped at 144. If I had a bit more powerful card, this would be absolutely perfect because then I could be running at that high refresh rate with a good cap of 144. And if we start fighting, but it's important to, again, look at those frame times. See what they look like. Super important. So I'd say this is about as good as we're going to get. If I wasn't doing the high refresh monitor like I have, I wouldn't even bother with this utility and getting above those FPS. I just kind of want to give it an option. And also, if you're like in a game with another hard cap like this, look for these secondary mods. You can find them at like Nexus Mods, or this instance, a coworker of mine actually went ahead and said, hey man, if you're playing Elden Ring, definitely check this out. And yeah, that's basically what is happening here with this specific box. If you can't find like an FPS unlocker, most games aren't capped at 60 FPS, but those that are typically can be modded. Just know it does remove a lot of the offline mode. But I wanted to at least show that utility for those Elden Ring players out there, because having like an ultra wide monitor and there was no native support and it being capped at 60, I thought was kind of crappy, and that was one fix for it. A lot of people walk through each one of those settings. In each game, it depends on what it is, but just know it's not usually a massive swing. In some games, those in-game settings help a little bit more, but never just leaving it right at stock defaults. And also, don't obsess over FPS. If you only have a 60 hertz monitor, cap it at 60 FPS. You shouldn't be going above it. If you have a 4K monitor, don't force every game to run at 4K, because some games run like garbage at 4K, no matter your system layout. And you need to variate that and look at your FPS, look at your frame times. If you're seeing tons of jagged things throughout your gameplay, that's going to be a horrible experience, and you should reduce your resolution after turning off like depth of field, ambient occlusion, and that should help you get it going. But don't jack everything down to low settings and run at 4K. If you do that, you're just doing yourself a massive disservice. And this is how I optimize for gameplay, so I have the best experience in every game, and I just have a good time when I'm in Windows and I'm playing games. I don't like to be bothered, and I don't like my games to look like garbage. It should look a lot better than a PlayStation 5 or a regular PlayStation. Console gaming should not be a better experience, even though a lot of times it is, because people don't understand the settings, and a lot of times it's too convoluted. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Did this help you? Please drop it a like if it did. And thank you to all the people that support me, make these videos on the channel at christitus.com and clicking the join button down below. And if you'd like to catch me live streaming on Twitch, check me out over there. Sometimes I've been playing this almost every day over there, but I do live streams here on YouTube every Friday as well, if you want to catch me here. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.